It was a quiet morning in the park as an elderly woman strolled along the path with her loyal dog by her side. She enjoyed her daily walks, finding peace in the gentle rustling of the leaves and the occasional chirping of birds. Her dog, a majestic German shepherd, trotted confidently ahead, always alert but calm. To onlookers, they seemed like an ordinary pair, a kind woman and her faithful companion. But what no one knew was that this dog had a past, one that would soon change everything. As the woman walked deeper into the park, two men appeared in the distance. At first glance, they looked like they were just passing through. But their eyes followed her, their movements calculated and deliberate. They whispered to each other, their intent growing darker with every step. The woman, unaware of their presence, continued her walk, focusing on her dog's wagging tail and the peaceful scenery around her. The men began closing the distance, their faces betraying their intentions. One of them reached into his pocket, while the other glanced around, ensuring no one else was nearby. They assumed she was an easy target, an elderly woman alone with nothing but her dog to protect her. What they didn't realize, however, was that the German shepherd by her side wasn't just any pet. This dog had once been a highly trained police K-9, and his instincts hadn't dulled with time. Just as the tension in the air grew heavier, the dog's ears perked up, sensing danger before the woman even noticed. The men stepped closer, their confidence apparent, completely unaware of the storm they were walking into. What happened next would shock them, and anyone who thought they could underestimate this pair. The German shepherd's posture shifted, his body tensing as his sharp instincts detected the threat. His eyes darted toward the approaching men, and a low growl rumbled from his throat. The woman, startled by his sudden change in behavior, stopped in her tracks and looked around. At first, she couldn't see anyone and assumed it might just be another stray animal nearby. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she noticed the two men stepping closer, their expressions cold and predatory. Her heart began to race. Unaware of the dog's history, the men exchanged smug glances. One of them muttered under his breath, "It's just an old woman and her dog. This'll be easy." They had no idea they were about to provoke an animal trained for situations far more intense than this. As they inched forward, the dog moved protectively in front of the woman, his stance now firm, his growl deepening. The tension between the two sides hung thick in the air, like a coiled spring ready to snap. The woman, though frightened, gripped the leash tightly and tried to calm her dog. She didn't fully understand what was happening, but trusted his instincts implicitly. The German shepherd had been with her for years, ever since she adopted him from a local rescue center. She had always wondered why he was so disciplined and attentive, but now those traits seemed to take on a new meaning. It was as if a switch had flipped in the dog, and the gentle companion she knew was now laser-focused on the potential danger. Meanwhile, the men weren't deterred. One of them pulled out a small knife, thinking it would intimidate her into submission. But they didn't anticipate what would happen the moment they crossed that invisible line, stepping too close to the woman and her fiercely loyal dog. The men stepped closer, their voices low but filled with menace. "Hand over your bag, lady, and nobody gets hurt," one of them said, the knife in his hand glinting in the sunlight. The woman's breath hitched, and she tightened her grip on the leash, feeling her dog shift his weight, as if preparing for something. She tried to stay calm, her heart pounding in her chest, but fear was hard to ignore when faced with such a threat. Still, her dog's unwavering presence gave her a shred of courage. The German shepherd's growls grew louder, his teeth bared, and his stance now rigid, like a soldier ready for battle. The men exchanged uneasy glances. They hadn't expected the dog to react this way. "It's just a dog," one of them muttered, trying to brush off his unease. But something about the animal's focus and intensity made them hesitate for a brief moment. That hesitation, however, wasn't enough to stop their plan. One of the men lunged toward the woman, his knife raised, while the other tried to grab her bag. It was at that precise moment the dog sprang into action. With lightning speed, He barked ferociously and lunged forward, yanking the leash from the woman's hands. The sound of his bark echoed through the park, loud and commanding, startling the attackers. The knife-wielding man froze mid-step, suddenly realizing he was not dealing with an ordinary pet. The woman stumbled backward, watching in shock as her dog moved with precision and determination. It was as if years of training had come flooding back in an instant. The second man reached for the knife, shouting, "Control your dog." But it was too late. The dog was now between the woman and the attackers, ready to do whatever it took to protect her. The park, once peaceful and quiet, was now filled with tension as the confrontation reached its boiling point. The dog stood firm, his sharp bark slicing through the air, sending a ripple of fear through the men. But instead of retreating, one of them tried to feign bravery. "It's just a dog. Get out of here," he yelled, stepping forward and waving the knife in an attempt to intimidate. The dog didn't flinch. His focus was unshakable, his movements calculated. It became clear this wasn't an ordinary household pet, but something far more formidable. One of the men muttered under his breath, "This isn't worth it," and started to back away. But the other, more stubborn and emboldened by his own desperation, refused to relent. The woman, trembling but resolute, shouted, "You have no idea what you're up against. Don't make it worse for yourselves." Her words only seemed to agitate the remaining man, his grip on the knife tightening. Just as he took another step forward, a sudden booming voice broke through the chaos. "Drop the weapon now." A plainclothes officer, who had been jogging nearby, had stopped in his tracks, pulling out his badge and identifying himself. The men turned in surprise, their confidence crumbling. But the officer wasn't the only twist. He looked at the German shepherd, and with a note of recognition, called the dog by name, Ace. The dog's ears perked up at the familiar sound, briefly glancing at the officer before resuming his protective stance. The attacker's confusion deepened, and the officer explained to the woman, "That's a retired K-9. He's a hero." The realization sent chills down her spine. Ace wasn't just any dog. He was a highly trained professional. The stakes had just been raised. The attackers, still cornered and unsure, had no idea what kind of trouble they had truly stumbled into. The tension in the park thickened as everyone braced for what would happen next. The tension in the park reached its peak as Ace stood his ground, his deep growls resonating like a warning bell. The officer kept his focus on the men, one hand resting on his holstered firearm. "I said drop the weapon," he repeated, his voice sharp and commanding. The man holding the knife hesitated, his bravado visibly cracking. His accomplice had already dropped his stance, inching backward as fear began to overtake him. The knife clattered to the ground, the sound echoing in the stillness. Ace advanced a step, his movements slow and deliberate, keeping the men frozen in place. The officer quickly moved in, securing the knife and gesturing for the men to get on the ground. But just as everyone thought it was over, a sudden yelp came from Ace, breaking the calm. The elderly woman turned to see her dog limping slightly, his paw caught on a sharp twig hidden in the grass. Her heart clenched with worry, but before she could react, the officer stepped in. "He's okay," he reassured her, crouching to carefully free Ace's paw. The dog licked his hand in acknowledgement, his posture softening for the first time since the confrontation began. As the officer secured the two attackers and called for backup, the woman looked at Ace with tears of relief in her eyes. "You saved me," she whispered, her hand trembling as she stroked his head. But the twist came when the officer revealed the true depth of Ace's story. He wasn't just a police dog, the officer said, his voice tinged with admiration. "Ace was my partner. We worked together for years before he retired." The woman gasped, realizing that fate had brought her a guardian in the form of this incredible animal. As the police arrived to take the men into custody, Ace stood tall, his protective instincts unwavering. The woman couldn't help but marvel at how her life, and Ace's, had intertwined at just the right moment. It was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, heroes could come in the most unexpected forms. As the police led the two attackers away, the elderly woman felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for both Ace and the officer. The park, which had moments earlier been filled with tension and fear, was now calm, the quiet sounds of nature slowly returning. Ace, despite the scrape on his paw, stood beside her, his eyes watchful but no longer filled with the intense focus of before. He seemed to sense that the danger had passed, and with a gentle nudge of his head, he reassured her that he was still by her side. The officer stayed a moment longer, ensuring she felt safe and offering to walk her home. As they strolled back to her house, she learned more about Ace's history. The bond between the officer and his former K-9 partner had been deep, and though Ace had retired, he remained the loyal, brave dog he'd always been. "When I heard he needed a home," the officer shared, "I knew he deserved to be somewhere he'd be loved and cared for. Seeing him protect you today proves that decision was the right one." Once home, the woman knelt beside Ace and hugged him tightly. She felt an immense connection to the dog who had become her protector, her friend, and now her hero. The officer assured her that the attackers would face justice and left her with his contact information, promising to check in. In the days that followed, Ace became a local hero. Neighbors stopped to share kind words, and news of his bravery spread. But for the elderly woman, Ace was more than a story. He was a reminder of the power of loyalty, courage, and unexpected blessings. Their bond only deepened, proving that sometimes the most extraordinary heroes come with wagging tails and unwavering hearts.